The Arizona sun was a merciless hammer, and for a widow like Josephine Callahan, every day was a battle fought against the dust, the silence, and the ghosts of a life that might have been. Her small ranch nestled by Willow Creek was her fortress and her prison. The creek itself was her only solace, a ribbon of cool relief in a scorched land. But one sweltering afternoon, that solace was shattered. Hidden in the cottonwoods, she saw him, an Apache warrior standing in the crystalline water. And in that forbidden, heart-stopping moment, before fear could take hold, her eyes were drawn to the raw power of his form, the sun glinting off the chiseled contours of his body, a sight that would change her world forever. The year was 1878, and the silence in Josephine Callahan's life was a physical thing. It was in the dust motes, dancing in the sunbeams that sliced through her cabin, in the empty chair across the small, scarred table, and in the vast, aching expanse of the Arizona Territory that stretched out from her porch. Her husband, Jebediah, hadn't been a man of many words, but his presence had filled the silence. His heavy boots on the floorboards, the off-key tune he'd whistle while mending tack, the sheer solidness of him had been an anchor. Now, 2 years after the fever had taken him, the silence was all she had left. Josephine was not a woman given to self-pity. She was tall and lean, with hands calloused from work Jebediah had once done. Her hair, the color of sun-bleached wheat, was usually pinned in a severe bun, but stray strands always escaped to frame a face that was more handsome than pretty, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of a stormy sky. She ran the small ranch Callahan's claim with a grim determination that earned her a measure of grudging respect from the folks in the nearby town of Redemption. They called her the White Widow of Willow Creek, a name that felt both like a title and a sentence. Her land was modest, but it had one priceless feature: the creek. Willow Creek cut through the northern edge of her property, a year-round artery of life in a land that was mostly rock and thirst. It was the reason Jebediah had staked this claim, and the reason she refused to sell, despite the persistent, almost predatory offers from Silas Croft, a cattle baron whose vast holdings surrounded her small plot like a patient wolf. On this particular August afternoon, the heat was a physical weight. The air shimmered above the baked earth, and the distant Chiricahua Mountains were hazy purple ghosts on the horizon. Josephine had spent the morning reinforcing a corral fence, the rhythmic thud of her hammer, the only sound besides the buzz of cicadas. By midday, sweat plastered her muslin shirt to her back, and the thirst was a fire in her throat. Her ritual on days like this was a small private luxury, a trip to the secluded bend in the creek, shaded by a thick stand of ancient cottonwoods and willows. She left her rifle, a heavy 1873 Winchester, leaning against the cabin door, a rare oversight born of heat-addled exhaustion. She only took a small bar of lye soap and a threadbare towel, her worn leather boots crunching on the dry grass. As she neared the creek, the air grew cooler, filled with the scent of damp earth and green leaves. It was her sanctuary. She slipped through the familiar curtain of willow branches and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The creek was not empty. Standing midstream, not 20 yards from her, was a man. He was turned away from her, the water swirling around his thighs. He was an Apache. There was no mistaking the long, jet-black hair that fell unbound down his back, the copper tone of his skin, or the breechcloth and moccasins lying on a flat rock by the bank. A lone hawk feather was tied into his hair. He was using his hands to scoop water and let it run over his shoulders and chest, the movement fluid and utterly unself-conscious. Josephine's first instinct was pure, cold terror. The stories in Redemption were fuel for nightmares. Apache raids, scalps, and brutal, merciless warfare. The army at Fort Bowie called them ghosts, phantoms of the mountains who struck without warning. She was alone, unarmed. A wave of dizziness washed over her, a combination of heat and fear. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum in the sudden, profound silence. She should run. She should scream. She should already be dead. But she didn't move. She stood frozen, a statue hidden by the trembling willow leaves, her eyes locked on the scene. He moved with a grace that was animalistic, and yet deeply human, a part of the landscape, in a way she, with her fences and her cabin, could never be. As he turned slightly to rinse his face, she saw his profile, a strong jaw, a proud aquiline nose. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps her own age of 28, perhaps a little more. Then he arched his back to sluice the water from his hair, and the full force of the sun caught him. The sight struck Josephine with an unexpected, shocking force that had nothing to do with fear. It was the sheer physical perfection of him. Water cascaded over broad shoulders and down a back laced with lean, powerful muscle. As he straightened, she saw the taut plane of his stomach, the sharp, defined ridges of his abdomen. It wasn't the brawny bulk of a town blacksmith. It was the chiseled functional strength of a predator, every line and sinew honed by a life of hardship and constant motion. Her late husband, Jebediah, had been a good man, a strong man, but soft in the way of settlers who relied on tools more than their own bodies. This was different. This was elemental. A strange, unfamiliar heat bloomed in her chest, a feeling so alien and unwelcome it momentarily eclipsed her terror. It was a flush of shame, of confusion, of a deeply buried and long-forgotten part of herself stirring to life. She was a widow, a respectable woman, and she was staring mesmerized at the near-naked body of an Apache warrior, a man who would likely kill her if he knew she was there. The absurdity, the danger, the sheer madness of the moment crashed down on her. She had to get away. Taking a slow, silent step backward, she tried to retreat into the thicker foliage. But her foot, clumsy with haste, landed squarely on a dry, brittle twig. Crack! The sound was like a rifle shot in the stillness. The warrior's head snapped up. His entire body went rigid, coiling with a sudden, lethal tension. In a single, impossibly fast movement, he spun around to face her, dropping into a low crouch in the water. His eyes found hers through the screen of leaves. They were dark, piercing, and held no surprise, only a flat, cold, and immediate assessment of a threat. He wasn't scared. He was calculating. In his hand, which had been empty a second before, was a knife. It seemed to have materialized from nowhere, its blade dark and menacing. The world seemed to stop. The cicadas went silent. The creek ceased its gurgling. There was only the space between them, charged with a voltage that was thicker than the humid air. He was a cornered wolf. She was a startled deer, and Josephine Callahan, widow of Willow Creek, knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she was about to die. Time stretched into a taut humming wire. Josephine's mind, which had been a whirlwind of panic, went unnervingly calm. She saw everything with a preternatural clarity, the way the water dripped from the warrior's black hair, the tension in the cords of his neck, the white-knuckled grip he had on the dark handle of his knife. His eyes fixed on her were unnervingly intelligent. They weren't the wild, hate-filled eyes of the savages from the penny dreadfuls. They were the eyes of a man who saw her not as a woman, but as an intruder, a potential enemy, a piece of a world that had brought his people nothing but pain. She knew screaming was useless. No one would hear. Running was equally futile. He would be upon her before she took 3 steps. His movements in the water had been that swift. He moved like a striking snake. All she had was the stillness, the the quiet dignity she had cultivated in her widowhood. She held his gaze, her own storm-blue eyes refusing to look away. It was a strange, primal act of defiance. If she was to die here in her own sanctuary, she would not die cowering. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her empty hands, palms forward, showing she was unarmed. She kept the lye soap and towel clutched in one hand, a pathetic symbol of her peaceful intentions. The warrior did not relax. His eyes narrowed, scanning the trees behind her, searching for the ambush for the husband or brother with a rifle. When he found no one, his gaze returned to her, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Confusion, contempt. He rose from his crouch, the water sluicing from his powerful frame. He did it with a deliberate slowness, a display of confidence that was more intimidating than any sudden move. He was in control. He walked out of the creek, his wet skin gleaming in the dappled sunlight, and stood by the flat rock where his things lay. He never took his eyes off her. He didn't bother to cover himself. The concept of shame seemed utterly alien to him. He was as natural in his nakedness as the hawk circling overhead. He said something. The word was low and guttural, a sound like rocks grinding together. It was a question, but the language was utterly foreign from the Chiricahua dialect she'd heard described but never encountered. Josephine shook her head slightly. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice raspy. He watched her lips move, his expression unchanging. He was a mask of carved, sun-darkened stone. He gestured with his knife, a short, sharp flick of the wrist towards her cabin. The meaning was clear. What are you doing here? This is not your place. Except it was her place. Legally. According to a piece of paper filed in a dusty office in Redemption, the irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. This is my land, she said, her voice a little stronger now. She pointed to the ground at her feet. My land. A muscle feathered in his jaw. The word land seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with the weight of 1,000 bloody conflicts. To him, the concept of one person owning the earth, owning a creek, was likely an obscenity. He responded with another string of harsh syllables, his tone flat and dismissive. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, two people from different universes, separated by a chasm of language, culture, and history, with only 20 yards of sun-drenched creek bank between them. Josephine felt the adrenaline begin to wane, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The threat of Silas Croft and his lawyers seemed like a gentleman's disagreement compared to this raw, elemental confrontation. Croft wanted her land. This man seemed to challenge her very right to exist upon it. Then something shifted. His eyes flickered down to the bar of lye soap still clutched in her hand, then back to her face. He saw her sweat-stained work shirt, the grime on her hands, the exhaustion etched around her eyes. He was a man who lived by observation, and he was observing her now, not just as a white woman, but as something else. Perhaps he saw not an invader, but a survivor, same as him. With a final lingering look that felt as though it were peeling back the layers of her soul, he made a decision. He bent down, scooped up his breechcloth and moccasins with his free hand, and without a backward glance, melted into the dense thicket on the far side of the creek. He didn't make a sound. One moment he was there, a formidable breathing presence of muscle and menace. The next, he was simply gone. The only evidence he had ever existed were the dark, wet footprints on the rocks, already beginning to fade in the oppressive heat. Josephine didn't realize she'd been holding her breath until it came out in a shuddering gasp. Her knees felt weak, and she leaned against a cottonwood for support, pressing her forehead against the rough bark. The soap and towel fell from her nerveless fingers. She was alive. She was unharmed. But she was not unchanged. The encounter had shaken something loose inside her. The stark male beauty of the warrior was tangled up with the primal fear he had inspired. The image of his body glistening in the sun was burned into her mind, a dangerous and thrilling secret. He was the embodiment of everything her world feared and sought to destroy, and yet in his eyes she had seen a reflection of her own lonely defiance. She didn't bathe. The sanctuary had been violated, the peace of the place shattered. She picked up her soap and towel and walked back to the cabin, her senses on high alert. Every rustle of a lizard in the brush, every shadow thrown by a passing cloud, seemed to hold a threat. When she reached her porch, she snatched up the Winchester, the cold, heavy steel, a comforting and familiar weight in her hands. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, Josephine Callahan sat on her porch, the rifle across her lap. She was watching the tree line by the creek. She knew she should ride to Redemption and tell Sheriff Coleman. An Apache warrior on her land was a threat to the entire settlement. It was her duty, but she didn't. Telling the sheriff would bring a posse. Men with rifles and hatred in their eyes would come trampling through her property, hunting him. And the thought of that, of his beautiful, powerful body, riddled with bullets lying broken in the creek where she had first seen him, filled her with a surprising and deeply unsettling wave of protectiveness. He had held her life in his hand. He had seen her vulnerable and alone, and had chosen to walk away. Why, it was a question that lodged itself deep in her heart, a splinter of mystery in the lonely silence of her life. The White Widow of Willow Creek had a secret now, and she had a feeling that the silence she had known before was nothing compared to the silence she would have to keep now. The days that followed the encounter at the creek were fraught with a new kind of tension. Josephine found herself living on a knife's edge of awareness. The familiar landscape of her ranch was now alien territory, every shadow a potential hiding place, every gust of wind a whisper of a forgotten language. She took the Winchester with her everywhere, even to the well just steps from her cabin door. She scanned the ridge lines constantly, her eyes searching for the silhouette of a lone rider, for a sign that she was still being watched. There was nothing. The land was as empty and impassive as it had always been. The warrior had vanished as completely as a morning mist. Yet his presence lingered. Josephine would find herself at the kitchen window, staring towards the creek, her mind replaying the scene with a vividness that made her cheeks flush. The fear had receded, leaving behind a complex cocktail of curiosity, awe, and a strange, unnameable longing. Her dealings with the world of men, meanwhile, grew more fraught. 2 weeks after her silent confrontation, Silas Croft paid her a visit. He didn't ride up like a neighbor. He arrived in a smart buckboard, flanked by 2 hard-faced riders' men with notches on their gun belts and mean, squinting eyes. Croft himself was a man who seemed to take up more space than he was entitled to. He was large and fleshy with a thick mustache that failed to hide a perpetually smug expression. He dressed in tailored suits that were absurdly out of place in the dusty territory, a testament to his wealth and his contempt for the land that gave it to him. Mrs. Callahan, he boomed, dismounting and striding onto her porch as if he owned it. Still stubbornly clinging to this patch of dust, I see. It's my patch of dust, Mr. Croft, Josephine replied coolly, not moving from her chair. The Winchester lay across her lap, her hand resting casually on the stock. Croft's eyes flickered to the rifle. Always so inhospitable. I've come with another offer, a generous one. $500. More than this place will ever be worth. You could move into town live comfortably, A woman alone shouldn't be out here. It's not proper. And it's certainly not safe. He gestured vaguely towards the mountains. The Apache are restless. I feel safer here than I do in your company, Mr. Croft, she said, her voice like ice. The answer is no. It will always be no. This was my husband's land, and now it's mine. Please leave. Croft's face purpled. His veneer of civility cracked. You're a foolish woman, Josephine. Water is becoming scarce. A stubborn widow sitting on the best water source in this county is a problem. And problems one way or another have a way of getting solved. He turned and left without another word. His threat hung in the air, thick and oily. The following week, the solving began. She woke one morning to find the wire to her northern pasture cut her small herd of 7 cattle scattered. It took her a full day under the brutal sun to round them up. A few days later, she found one of her best heifers dead by the creek, a small, neat hole behind its ear. It wasn't the work of a predator. A wolf or a mountain lion would have torn it apart. This was a message. She rode into redemption, her face set in a grim mask. Sheriff Bartholomew, Bart Coleman, was a decent man, but weary and overworked. He listened to her story, stroking his greying beard. I hear you, Josie, he said, his voice tired. But you have no proof it was Croft's men. Could have been drifters. Could have been Indians. It was not an Apache, Josephine said with a certainty that surprised even herself. They wouldn't waste a bullet on a cow unless they were starving, and they wouldn't leave the meat. Sheriff Coleman sighed. Silas Croft brings a lot of business to this town. He's got friends in Prescott. My hands are tied without proof. I'll ride out and have a word with his foreman, but that's all I can do. You should reconsider his offer, Josie. It's a hard life for a woman. She left the sheriff's office feeling more alone than ever. The law, it seemed, was a luxury for men like Croft. For her, there was only the Winchester and her own grit. That night, a storm rolled in a rare and violent deluge that turned her dusty yard into a sea of mud. Exhausted and disheartened, she fell into a troubled sleep. She awoke just before dawn to a strange sound, the soft, rhythmic scrape of wood on stone. Her heart leaped into her throat. Grabbing the rifle, she crept to the window and peered out into the grey pre-dawn light. She saw him. The Apache warrior was there just at the edge of her yard. He was crouched by her grinding wheel, the one Jebediah had built near the barn. In his hands was her axe, its edge dull and nicked from her recent fence mending. With a patient, focused intensity, he was sharpening the blade, his powerful shoulders moving with a smooth, practiced rhythm. The storm had washed him clean, and in the dim light he looked like a bronze statue come to life. She watched breathless for several minutes. He wasn't a threat. He was helping. When the axe was honed to a razor's edge, he tested it on his thumb with a grim satisfaction. He then stood, walked silently to her woodpile, and with 3 swift, impossibly clean blows, split a large log into perfect quarters. He stacked the wood neatly, placed the sharpened axe atop the pile, and turned to leave. Before he could disappear, Josephine acted on an impulse she didn't understand. She unbolted her door and stepped out onto the porch. "Wait," she called out, her voice soft in the damp air. He stopped instantly, turning to face her. He stood about 30 yards away, a silent, watchful figure. He wasn't holding a knife this time. His hands were empty. She didn't know what to say. "Thank you," she managed, gesturing towards the axe. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His eyes, even from a distance, were intense. They swept over her, then flickered towards the northern pasture where her cattle were. He pointed in that direction, then made a gesture with his hand, like a snake, slithering through grass. He was talking about Croft's men, the ones who snuck onto her land. Then he spoke. It was one word, slow and deliberate, as if testing the shape of it on his tongue. Coyote. He was giving Croft's men a name, a scavenger, a sneaky predator. Josephine nodded, understanding perfectly. Yes, Coyote. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he pointed to his own chest. Kyle, he said. It was his name. He was giving her his name. It felt like a gift of immense value, a bridge being built stone by stone across the chasm that separated them. Josephine, she said, pointing to herself. Kyle nodded again. He lingered for a second more, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Then, as before, he turned and vanished into the landscape, swallowed by the morning mist rising from the wet earth. Josephine walked over to the woodpile. She picked up the axe. The edge was lethally sharp, far better than she could have ever managed. He had seen her struggle. He had seen the way Croft was tightening the noose around her, and in his own silent, indirect way, he had chosen a side. He had offered help. That morning, as she drank her coffee, the silence of the cabin felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of a shared secret, the echo of a name, and the promise of an alliance, as dangerous and as vital as the wild land itself. The unspoken alliance between Josephine and Kyle solidified in the weeks that followed, not through words, but through actions. He became a ghostly guardian of her ranch. She would find signs of him everywhere, subtle testaments to his presence. A dead rattlesnake left on her porch, its head neatly severed. A pile of fresh kindling appearing by her door on a cold morning. Once after a windstorm tore shingles from her barn roof, she awoke to find them mysteriously replaced, secured with pegs of carved mesquite in a way she'd never seen before. She began leaving things for him in return. At the edge of the woods near the creek, she would leave a pouch of tobacco she'd bought in redemption, or a small sack of flour. Sometimes she'd leave a jar of jerky. The items would always be gone by the next morning, and in their place might be a handful of wild onions or a clutch of quail eggs nestled in a bed of soft grass. It was a silent, careful barter, a conversation held through objects, each one a testament to a fragile, growing trust. Their face-to-face encounters were rare and brief. He seemed to sense when she was most in need. One afternoon her water pump broke. The handle went limp, and no amount of jiggling or cursing would bring a drop of water from the well. It was a disaster. Without the pump, she'd have to haul water by the bucket from the creek, an exhausting, back-breaking task. As she stood staring at the useless contraption in despair, he emerged from the trees. He walked directly to the well, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He didn't speak, but motioned for her to stand aside. For the next hour, she watched, fascinated, as he dismantled the pump mechanism with a quiet, focused efficiency. His hands, which she knew could be deadly, were surprisingly deft. He used his knife to fashion a new leather washer from a scrap she had in the barn, and a piece of wire to fix a broken linkage. He worked with an intuitive understanding of mechanics that was completely at odds with her image of a savage. When he was done, he motioned for her to try. She tentatively worked the handle. It moved smoothly, and with a gratifying gush, cool, clear water poured into the trough. Relief and gratitude washed over her. "Cale," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you." He looked at her, his dark eyes studying her face. He touched the pump, then pointed towards the distant mountains. "Iron horse," he said, using one of the few English words he seemed to know. He was trying to explain something, a connection. She pieced it together. The railroad, the army. He had seen their machines, their technology, and with his sharp, observant mind, he had understood them. He learned not from books, but from watching his enemies. "You are very smart," she said softly. A flicker of something pride perhaps passed across his stoic features. He then pointed to a cluster of plants growing near her fence-line ones she had always considered weeds. He walked over, pulled one up by the root, and mimed digging and cooking it. Then he pointed to another, a leafy green, and crushed a leaf, gesturing to a long faded scar on his forearm, indicating it was for wounds. He was teaching her. He was showing her the language of the land, a language she had lived on, but never understood. She who could read and write and do arithmetic was a child in this world compared to him. He showed her how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to find water, by watching the flight of certain birds. She in turn began to teach him English. She would point to objects and say their names clearly. Cabin, horse, sky. He was a quick study, his pronunciation halting at first, but his memory sharp. He had a particular fascination with the written word. She showed him a book, and he traced the letters with a calloused finger, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if trying to decipher a strange new set of tracks. During these quiet lessons, the physical space between them began to shrink. He would stand closer to her, and she found she no longer felt the cold prickle of fear, but a strange humming awareness of his presence. She was acutely conscious of his scent, a mix of pine smoke leather and the clean smell of the earth. She remembered the sight of him in the creek, and a warmth would spread through her that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. One evening, as twilight settled, casting long shadows across the yard, he told her a piece of his story. His English was still broken, a patchwork of Apache words and new vocabulary, but she understood. "Soldiers," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Blue coats. They come to my Cayuda." He struggled for the word. "Village," she offered. He nodded. "Village, fire, my wife, my son, gone." He looked away towards the mountains, his jaw tight, and a profound, bottomless grief emanated from him. For the first time she saw past the warrior and glimpsed the man, a man whose loneliness and loss mirrored her own. Impulsively, she reached out and rested her hand on his forearm. His skin was warm and solid under her touch. The muscles there were like steel cables. He went rigid at the contact, a wild, untamed thing, unused to gentle touch. But he didn't pull away. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, and his dark eyes were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion. In that moment, the last vestiges of fear and prejudice crumbled within Josephine. He was not the other. Whew. He was Kyle, a man who had suffered, who had survived, and who, against all odds, had shown her a kindness and protection her own people had denied her. The connection between them was no longer just about survival or a secret alliance. It was becoming something deeper, something more personal and far more dangerous for them both. The world outside Callahan's claim would never understand it. To the people of Redemption, he was a savage. To his people, she was an enemy. They were two people adrift, finding a small island of understanding in a vast ocean of hate. And as the last light faded from the sky, Josephine knew with a terrifying certainty that this island was the only place she truly wanted to be. The fragile peace at Willow Creek was shattered by the arrival of autumn. The cottonwood leaves turned a brittle gold, and a chill wind began to blow down from the Chiricahuas. It was a wind of change, and it carried the scent of trouble. Silas Croft had been quiet for too long. His subtle campaign of harassment had ceased, and an unnerving calm had settled over the valley. Josephine knew it was the calm before a storm. Men like Croft didn't simply give up. They escalated. The escalation came in the form of a stolen horse. Not one of Josephine's, but belonging to a neighboring rancher, a man named Patterson, who was known for his hot temper and deep-seated hatred of the Apache. The horse was a prize stallion, and its disappearance sent shockwaves through the small community. 2 days later, Croft and Patterson rode into redemption, their faces masks of grim outrage. They went straight to Sheriff Coleman's office, and the news spread through the town like wildfire. They had found tracks. Not just any tracks, but the tracks of a single rider wearing Apache moccasins, and those tracks, they claimed, led directly from Patterson's ranch towards the hills bordering the one place a lone Apache might find shelter and water, the Callahan claim. It was a brilliant, viciously clever move. Croft hadn't accused Josephine of anything directly. He had simply painted a target on the unseen spectral presence near her land, a presence the town was already primed to fear and despise. He was using their prejudice as a weapon. Sheriff Coleman, accompanied by a posse of 5 grim-faced ranchers, including Patterson, rode out to Josephine's ranch that afternoon. She saw the dust cloud of their approach from a mile away and felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She met them on the porch, her Winchester held loosely in her hands. "Josie." The sheriff began, his tone formal and uneasy. "We're not here to trouble you, but Patterson's stallion was stolen 2 nights ago. The tracks lead this way. Have you seen anyone? Any strangers on your land?" "I've seen no one." She lied, her voice steady. Every protective instinct screamed at her to deny, to deflect. Patterson, a raw-boned man with cruel eyes, spat on the ground. "She's lying, Bart. Everyone knows this patch of land is cursed. Her husband dies, and she stays out here, alone. It ain't natural. She's probably been trading with the savages." "That's enough, Jeb," the sheriff warned, but the other men in the posse murmured in agreement. The seeds of suspicion were taking root. "We need to search your property, Josie." Coleman said, his face apologetic but firm. "Specifically the area around the creek. If there's an Apache camp here, we need to know. It's for the safety of everyone." Josephine's heart hammered. Kyle had no camp. He moved like the wind, leaving no trace. But what if they found one of the gifts she'd left? A tobacco pouch, a piece of cloth. It would be all the proof they needed. She had no choice but to let them pass. To refuse would be an admission of guilt. "Do what you must, Sheriff," she said, stepping aside. She watched as the posse fanned out their horses, trampling the fragile earth, their voices loud and coarse in the quiet of her valley. They were a violation, an invasion of the sanctuary she and Cale had built. She prayed he was miles away, deep in the mountains where he would be safe. An hour later, a triumphant shout came from the direction of the creek. Patterson came riding back, his face alight with malicious glee. Held aloft in his hand was a single perfect hawk feather, identical to the one Cale wore in his hair. "Found this snagged on a branch down by the water, Sheriff," he crowed. "Right where the tracks disappeared on the rocks. It's Apache, all right. He's been here." The atmosphere turned electric. The men's fear and hatred, which had been simmering now, had a focal point. "He's the one who killed my cow," another man shouted. "And stole my horse," Patterson added. "We have to flush him out." Sheriff Coleman looked at Josephine, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and accusation. "You lied to me, Josie. You've been harboring him." "I have done no such thing," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "A feather is not a man. You have no proof he did any of this." "It's proof enough for me," Patterson snarled, pulling his pistol from its holster. "He's probably watching us right now from the rocks. Let's send him a message." He raised his gun and fired a shot into the dense thicket across the creek, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. The men let out a whoop and followed his lead, firing their rifles and pistols indiscriminately into the woods, whooping and shouting, turning the tranquil creek into a war zone. It was a frenzy of mindless violence, a brutal release of their pent-up fears. Josephine stood on her porch, horrified. This was Croft's plan all along, to create an incident, to turn her peaceful land into a battlefield, to force her out by making her home the center of a conflict. And then, from high up on the ridge behind the cabin, came an answer. A single, piercing cry that was not human and not animal, but something in between. It was a sound of pure, chilling fury, an Apache war cry. The posse's celebratory gunfire sputtered into a shocked silence. Every man froze their faces, turning pale as they looked towards the ridge. They had been shooting at shadows. Now the shadow had a voice, and it was filled with rage. Sheriff Coleman was the first to regain his senses. "All right, that's enough," he yelled at his men. "Mount up, we're heading back to town. We'll come back tomorrow in force." The men needed no second urging. The bravado evaporated, replaced by a primal fear. They scrambled onto their horses and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and spent cartridges in their wake. Josephine was left alone in the ringing silence. The sun was setting, and the valley was plunged into shadow. The posse was gone, but the threat was greater than ever. They would be back, with more men. They would hunt Cale down, and Silas Croft, she knew, would be sitting in his fine house, smiling. He had checkmated her. She had to make a choice. She could run, pack a bag, abandon the ranch, and disappear before the war came to her doorstep. Or she could stay. She could stand her ground, but she could no longer stand alone. Her decision was made before the question had fully formed in her mind. She turned her back on the road to redemption and looked up at the darkening ridge where the cry had come from. "Cale!" she shouted, her voice carrying in the still evening air. "Cale!" She waited, her heart pounding. For a long time there was only the sound of the wind. Then a dark shape detached itself from the rocks, high above. He was coming. The hunt had been declared, the lines had been drawn, and Josephine Callahan had chosen her side. The war for Willow Creek was about to begin. Cale materialized at the edge of the woods as dusk settled, not a warrior coming for a fight, but a wraith drawn from the shadows. There was a new cold hardness in his eyes. The posse's reckless gunfire had been more than a provocation. It had been a desecration of a place he had come to regard with a tentative sense of peace. "They come back," he said. It wasn't a question. His English was surer now, honed by their quiet lessons, but his tone was clipped, stripped of all pleasantry. "Yes," Josephine affirmed, standing on her porch. The Winchester felt like an extension of her arm. "Tomorrow, with more men. They think you stole a horse." Kyle's lip curled in a slight sneer. "I do not steal horses. I take them. From soldiers, from enemies, not from a loud-mouthed farmer with one good stallion. This is the work of Coyote, Silas Croft." She nodded. "He wants this land. He wants the water. He's using you to scare me away." "He does not know what he hunts," Kyle said, his gaze sweeping over the valley, his eyes not just seeing, but reading the terrain. He was a general surveying his battlefield. "They will come from the road, spread out, try to drive me into the open." "What will we do?" Josephine asked, the "we" flowing from her lips as naturally as breath. In that moment, they were no longer a white woman and an Apache man. They were partners, defenders of this small patch of earth against a common foe. "A coyote is smart," Kyle said, a dangerous glint in his eye, "but he is also greedy. He walks into traps if the bait is good." "You," he said, looking at her, "are the bait. This cabin is the trap." For the rest of the night they worked under the cold light of a sliver moon. There was no more talk. There was only a shared purpose, an almost telepathic understanding of what needed to be done. Kyle directed their efforts with terse gestures and a few quiet words, his knowledge of guerrilla warfare a terrifying and brilliant thing to witness. He had Josephine fetch every rope and lariat she owned. He disappeared into the woods and returned with armfuls of dry, brittle branches and a large bundle of a particular weed he called ghost nettle. He had her fill every bucket and trough with water. Inside the cabin, they moved the heavy oak table to block the front window, leaving just enough space for the barrel of a rifle. They did the same with the back window, using her iron bedstead. Josephine's fear was replaced by a cold, focused resolve. Watching Cale work was like watching a master craftsman. He moved with an economy of motion, his every action precise and meaningful. He showed her how to rig a tripwire using a lariat and a precariously balanced pile of old milk cans inside the barn, a crude but effective alarm. He had her rub the ghost nettle leaves on several lengths of rope, explaining that the fine, almost invisible hairs would cause an intense, maddening itch on any skin they touched. These he strung at shin height, in the thickets on either side of the cabin. As dawn approached, he laid out the final, most crucial part of his plan. "They will expect me in the hills," he explained, pointing to the ridge. "I will not be there. I will be here." He tapped a spot on the ground near the creek, a dense cluster of rocks and willow that offered perfect concealment. "You will stay in the cabin. Do not fire until I do. Fire at the men on the edges, the ones who try to circle the cabin. Scare them. Drive them to the center. To Croft." He looked at her, his expression intense. "You are not a warrior, Josephine. Do not try to be. You are a protector. Protect your home. That is your strength." He reached out, and for a second, his fingers brushed her cheek. The touch was electric, a moment of profound connection in the face of imminent violence. "Be strong," he whispered. Then he was gone, melting into the pre-dawn gloom. Josephine bolted the cabin door and took her position at the front window. The waiting was the hardest part. The sun rose and the valley was deceptively peaceful. Then she saw the dust cloud. It was larger this time. She counted at least a dozen riders. Croft was with them at the front, alongside Sheriff Coleman and Patterson. They stopped 100 yards from the cabin. "Josephine Callahan!" Sheriff Coleman's voice boomed across the yard. "Come out with your hands up. We know he's in there with you." Josephine remained silent, her heart pounding, a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the Winchester. "Fine!" Patterson shouted. "If you won't come out, we'll burn you out." A few of the men dismounted their rifles ready. Croft stayed on his horse, a smug look on his face, directing them like chess pieces. "Flank the cabin," he ordered. "Two of you check the barn. Patterson, take 2 men and circle around the back. The rest of you with me. We'll go in the front." This was it. The coyotes were walking into the trap. The men heading for the barn were the first to find trouble. As the leader pushed open the door, the tripwire snapped and the pile of milk cans came crashing down with an almighty clang. The man yelled in surprise, stumbling backward. It was the signal. From the rocks by the creek, a single arrow hissed through the air. It didn't strike a man. It struck the wooden saddle of Patterson's horse. The stallion screamed and reared, throwing its rider to the ground. Chaos erupted. At the same instant, 2 of Croft's men, trying to sneak through the thicket, blundered into the ghost nettle ropes. Within seconds, they were yelping and cursing, scratching furiously at their legs and necks, their stealth completely compromised. "He's by the creek," someone yelled. Half the posse turned and fired wildly towards Kyle's position, but he was no longer there. He fired another arrow from a different spot, this one slicing the hat from another man's head. He was a phantom everywhere at once, sowing panic and confusion. Now it was Josephine's turn. As two men tried to take cover behind her water trough, she aimed the Winchester and fired. She didn't aim for them. She aimed for the trough itself. The bullet punched through the metal with a loud pang, and a jet of water erupted, soaking the men and making them scramble away in confusion. The posse was completely unnerved. They were being attacked from two sides by an enemy they couldn't see. They had expected to hunt a lone savage. Instead, they had walked into a meticulously prepared kill zone. "Where is he?" Croft bellowed, his face a mask of fury as his perfect plan unraveled. Sheriff Coleman, seeing his posse falling apart, tried to restore order. "Hold your ground, return fire." But Cale gave them no target. He used the land itself as his weapon. A thrown rock started a small landslide of pebbles down a slope, making the men think they were being attacked from a new direction. A perfect mimic of a hawk's cry from the left drew their attention just as an arrow flew from the right. Josephine, meanwhile, continued to fire single calculated shots from the cabin. She shattered a bottle on a man's saddle. She kicked up dust in front of them. She made the world around them an unpredictable, dangerous place. She wasn't trying to kill them. She was herding them. Just as Kyle had predicted, the panicked men abandoned the flanks and retreated towards the center of the yard, clustering around the only man who wasn't moving, Silas Croft. And that's when Kyle finally showed himself. He rose from behind a rock outcropping, not 40 yards from Croft, a bow in one hand, a single arrow nocked in the other. He was a figure of pure, terrifying vengeance. The posse froze, staring at the apparition they had been hunting. "Coyote!" Kyle called out, his voice clear and cold. "You bleed this land. You poison this water. Your hunt is over." Croft, his face pale with a mixture of fear and rage, fumbled for his pistol. "Savage, I'll kill you myself." He was too slow. Kyle drew the bowstring back to his ear. The movement was fluid, beautiful, and utterly lethal, but the arrow was not aimed at Croft's heart. The bowstring sang. The arrow flew, a blur of deadly grace. It struck the stock of Croft's ornate silver-inlaid rifle, which was still in its scabbard on his horse. The arrow hit with such force that it split the wood and pinned the rifle to the leather-shattering Croft symbol of power and authority. The message was unmistakable. "I could have killed you. I chose not to." At that moment, Sheriff Coleman made his choice. He was a lawman, not a murderer. "That's enough," he roared. "This is over. Everyone stand down." He looked from the terrifyingly calm Apache warrior to the sputtering, humiliated Silas Croft, and finally at the cabin where he knew Josephine Callahan was watching. He finally understood. "Croft," the sheriff said, his voice hard with newfound conviction. "You brought this on yourself. You've been lying to me this whole time. This isn't about a stolen horse. It's about this land." The fight was gone. The posse, cowed and defeated, lowered their weapons. Croft, his face a thunderous mask of hate, knew he had lost. He yanked his horse's reins and galloped away without a word, his men trailing sheepishly behind him. Sheriff Coleman was the last to leave. He stopped his horse and looked towards the cabin. "Josephine," he called out. I reckon you've made your point. I won't be bothering you again." He tipped his hat, a gesture of respect, and rode away. The dust settled. The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Josephine slowly unbolted the door and stepped out onto the porch, her body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline. Kyle was walking towards her from the creek. He stopped a few feet away, his chest rising and falling. They stood there looking at each other, the smoke and the chaos and the fear all fading away, leaving only the two of them. They had won. They had defended their island, and in the quiet aftermath of the battle, they both knew that nothing could ever be the same again. The aftermath of the siege left a new silence on Callahan's claim. It was not the aching void of loneliness, but a quiet filled with shared understanding. The boundary between the wildness of the creek and the domesticity of the cabin dissolved. Kyle stayed. He no longer vanished with the morning mist, but moved through her world as if he belonged there, his presence a steady, comforting weight. He taught her the secrets of the land with patient gestures. She read to him in the evenings, her voice weaving the magic of the written word into the firelit cabin. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the stars ignite the reality of their future settled between them. "The town will not forget," Kyle set his gaze on the distant glow of redemption. "No," Josephine agreed softly. "We'll be outcasts, the widow who sided with an Apache." He turned to her, his expression serious. "An Apache does not live on land," he corrected gently. "He lives with it. With you." The profound simplicity of his words struck her to the core. He wasn't just inhabiting her property. He was choosing to share her life. She looked at him, truly seeing the man behind the warrior, the survivor, the protector, her partner. Her late husband had built this cabin as a fortress to keep the wilderness out. But she now understood the wilderness was not an enemy to be walled off. Acting on an impulse that felt as natural as breathing, she reached for his hand. His fingers closed around hers, a warm, calloused, and infinitely gentle anchor. He leaned in and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of conquest or passion, but of deep, quiet recognition, the sealing of a pact forged in fire and fear. They knew their story would not have a fairy tale ending. The world beyond their valley remained hostile, and they would forever be exiles belonging to neither his people nor hers. But as Josephine leaned her head against his shoulder, the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the powerful resonant rhythm of a shared heartbeat. They had found their fortress not in walls of wood, but in each other, ready to face the future together. The story of Josephine Callahan and the warrior named Kyle is more than just a tale of forbidden love. It's a legend of the true West. It speaks of a time when survival depended not on the color of your skin, but on the courage in your heart. They were two people cornered by a hostile world who looked past their differences to find a shared humanity. Theirs is a story of defiance against prejudice, of building a bridge across an impossible divide, and of discovering that home isn't a place you own, but a person you protect. It reminds us that the most powerful legends aren't about grand battles, but about the quiet, world-changing moments of human connection. If their story of courage and forbidden love moved you, and you believe these legends of the Old West deserve to be told, please show your support. Like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to keep digging through the dust of history to bring these lost legends back to life. Let us know in the comments what you think of Josephine and Kyle's incredible stand at Willow Creek. Thank you for listening.